A single golden apple destroyed a civilization. Not a sword, not a siege engine, not even an army at first. Just a piece of fruit inscribed with 3 words that ignited divine vanity, sparked human passion, and condemned thousands to die on a distant shore. Before the 1,000 ships sailed, before Achilles dragged Hector's corpse through dust, before the wooden horse stood on Troy's beach, there was only a wedding, a snub, and a goddess who refused to be ignored. What followed was 10 years of blood, a war so vast it marked the end of the age of heroes, a conflict where gods fought beside mortals, and the line between glory and madness dissolved in the heat of battle. Tonight, we trace how that golden apple rolled from a wedding feast all the way to Troy's burning towers, and discover that perhaps the real tragedy wasn't the war itself, but how easily it all could have been avoided. So settle deeper into comfort. Let the tensions of your day drift away like smoke. Feel your breathing slow and deepen as we step back through 3 millennia to a world where bronze weapons gleamed in Mediterranean sunlight, where heroes were descended from gods, and where a single choice could doom an entire civilization. The story you think you know is just the surface. Beneath it lie layers of meaning, archaeological mysteries, and truths about human nature that have remained unchanged across 30 centuries. Close your eyes if you wish. The ancient world is waiting. The wedding that changed everything. Before Troy burned, before Helen sailed east with Paris, before Greek warriors assembled on distant shores, there was a wedding that should have been the social triumph of the age. The marriage of Peleus and Thetis united mortal and divine realms. A mortal hero king wed to a sea nymph of extraordinary beauty, one of the 50 daughters of the ancient sea god Nereus. This wasn't simply an advantageous match arranged by ambitious families. This was a union orchestrated by Zeus himself, king of the gods, for reasons that had everything to do with divine self-preservation and nothing to do with love. Zeus had desired Thetis. The sea nymph's beauty had captivated even the ruler of Olympus, and he pursued her with the single-minded determination characteristic of his many divine liaisons. But prophecy intervened. The fates declared that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father, more powerful, more glorious, more dangerous. If Zeus fathered that child, his own offspring would eventually overthrow him, perpetuating the cycle of divine patricide that had seen Zeus overthrow his father Cronus, who had overthrown his father Uranus before him. For once, Zeus exercised restraint. He decreed that Thetis must marry a mortal instead, ensuring her prophesied son, while greater than his human father, could never threaten the order of Olympus. Peleus was chosen for this honor, though the word honor carries a certain irony when one considers that Thetis herself had no voice in the decision. She was simply assigned to Peleus as reward for his devotion to the gods, as a chess piece moved across the divine game board. The wedding was planned as a magnificent celebration worthy of a union between mortal and immortal realms. Mount Pelion in Thessaly would host the festivities, every god and goddess of Olympus receiving an invitation. The celebration would feature ambrosia and nectar for the immortals, roasted meats and honeyed wine for mortals, musicians performing hymns honoring both bride and groom. Everything was arranged to perfection, every detail attended to, every protocol observed. Almost every protocol. In the rush of invitations and preparations, one goddess was deliberately excluded from the guest list. Eris, goddess of discord, strife, and chaos. The decision seemed logical at the time, based on what we can reasonably infer from her reputation in Greek mythology. Eris was known for causing trouble wherever she appeared, for transforming celebration into conflict, for exploiting weak points until harmony shattered into discord. The other gods apparently agreed that her presence would likely ruin the festivities, so they excluded her from what would become the most talked about wedding of the mythological age. But Eris, as ancient sources make clear, was not a goddess who accepted slights quietly. Being uninvited to the century's grandest social event stung her pride deeply. She brooded and planned, crafting revenge with a patience that suggests she understood human and divine psychology far better than those who had excluded her. She would not storm the wedding with violence. That would be crude and easily countered by the assembled gods. Instead, her revenge would be elegant, subtle, and devastating in its simplicity. She would give them exactly what they thought they wanted: a beautiful gift. On the wedding day, as gods assembled on Mount Pelion in their full glory, as Peleus and Thetis stood before divine witnesses, as celebration reached its peak with music and laughter and the clinking of golden cups, Eris made her entrance. Ancient sources vary on exactly how she managed this. Perhaps she appeared at the gathering's edge, uninvited but not forcibly removed. Perhaps she moved among them invisibly, cloaked by divine power. However she accomplished it, she brought with her a single object: a golden apple, perfect in form, glowing with inner light that caught every eye. The apple came from the garden of the Hesperides at the western edge of the world, where the tree of golden apples grew under the protection of the 100-headed dragon Ladon. These were no ordinary fruits, but objects of divine power, prizes worth dying for. This apple bore an inscription carved into its golden skin in letters that shimmered: Callist, to the fairest. 3 words in ancient Greek, 11 letters, enough to start a war. Eris, according to the mythological tradition preserved in sources like the lost epic poem Cypria, summarized by later writers, didn't make a speech or explain her gift. She simply tossed the apple into the midst of the celebrating gods and goddesses, then vanished, leaving behind chaos incarnate. The apple rolled across the divine table, catching light, drawing every eye to the fairest. But who was the fairest? Which goddess could claim that title above all others? 3 goddesses stepped forward almost simultaneously, each convinced the apple was meant for her. Hera, queen of the gods, embodiment of regal dignity and power. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, patron of heroes and cities. And Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty itself. Each was accustomed to admiration, to worship, to being acknowledged as supreme in her domain. Now they found themselves in direct competition, a contest none could afford to lose, without losing face before all Olympus. The argument escalated quickly from quiet statements of claim to raised voices, from appeals to reason, to barely veiled threats. Other gods took sides or wisely backed away. The celebration dissolved into quarreling, exactly as Eris had intended. Every eye turned to Zeus. Surely the king of gods could settle this dispute with a word. But Zeus, displaying political acumen that had kept him on Olympus's throne, refused to choose between his wife, his favorite daughter, and the goddess who controlled desire itself. Whichever two he rejected would make his existence unbearable. He needed someone else to judge, someone removed enough from divine politics to avoid immediate retaliation. Zeus declared that a mortal would decide which goddess was fairest. After consultation with Hermes, he selected Paris, a young prince of Troy living as a shepherd on Mount Ida. According to ancient traditions, Paris was known for fairness. He had recently judged a contest between bulls impartially, awarding the prize to Ares, even though the god had been disguised. If Paris could judge fairly when a god was involved, perhaps he could judge fairly between three goddesses. Hermes descended to Mount Ida, where Paris tended flocks in peaceful ignorance. The young shepherd prince, beautiful in the unconscious way of youth, looked up to see the messenger god appearing before him, accompanied by three goddesses more radiant and terrifying than any mortal should endure. Paris fell to his knees, certain he was about to die for some unknown offense. But Hermes explained that Paris must judge which goddess was fairest, awarding the golden apple to his choice. His decision would be final. Paris tried to decline, recognizing the trap. Choosing one goddess meant earning the enmity of the other two, but one does not refuse a direct command from Zeus. The goddesses, however, were not content to let beauty speak for itself. Each took Paris aside in turn, offering concrete bribes that ancient sources describe in detail. Hera promised power over all of Asia, dominion vast enough to make him the greatest king the world had known. Athena offered glory in war, victory in every battle, wisdom to outwit any enemy, immortal fame that would echo through eternity. Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, a mortal whose beauty rivaled even that of goddesses. Her name was Helen, and she lived in Sparta as wife to King Menelaus. Never mind that she was married, Aphrodite would ensure Helen loved Paris, that she would leave everything for him. Paris was young, a shepherd prince with no interest in conquest or battle. Power over Asia meant nothing to him. Glory in war held no appeal. But love, beauty, desire, these he understood. The vision of possessing the world's most beautiful woman, of being loved by her, made everything else seem trivial. Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, declaring her the fairest. Aphrodite accepted with a smile that promised everything Paris wanted. Hera and Athena withdrew in cold fury, their faces masks of rage barely contained by divine protocol. From that moment, they would work against Troy with every ounce of power they possessed. Paris had just acquired two divine enemies of terrifying potency for his city, his family, his people, and he, blinded by promised love, failed to see the catastrophe he had set in motion. The judgment of Paris, as it became known, was the true beginning of the Trojan War. The fairest woman in the world. If Paris had been promised the most beautiful woman in the world, understanding what that meant requires examining who Helen was and why her beauty would prove worth dying for. Helen of Sparta wasn't merely beautiful by mortal standards. Her beauty was divine in origin, descended from the gods themselves, of a quality that transcended ordinary human loveliness. Most accounts agree that Helen was the daughter of Zeus, though the circumstances of her conception vary. In the most popular telling, Zeus desired Leda, the beautiful queen of Sparta and wife of King Tyndareus, rather than approach her as a god in his true form, which would likely have proven fatal to a mortal woman. Zeus transformed himself into a swan, and in that form either seduced or assaulted Leda. Ancient sources use language that remains ambiguous about consent. This bizarre union resulted in Leda laying 1 or 2 eggs, from which hatched Helen, her brothers Castor and Pollux, the famous Dioscuri, and sometimes her sister Clytemnestra. The image of Helen emerging from an egg, divine and perfect from birth, captured Greek imagination. She wasn't subject to normal human development. She emerged complete, her beauty fully formed, created by Zeus through the strange mechanics of divine shapeshifting. Her divine parentage meant she was not fully human. Half her essence came from the king of gods. This heritage manifested not just in her appearance, but in her very nature, in a quality that set her apart from ordinary women. As Helen grew to young womanhood in Sparta, her extraordinary beauty became obvious to everyone who saw her. This was not beauty that could be hidden or downplayed. It radiated from her like light from flame, drawing every eye, captivating every heart. Even as a child, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, she was kidnapped by Theseus, the great king of Athens and slayer of the Minotaur. He took her to Athens, planning to marry her when she came of age. But her brothers tracked her down and rescued her before Theseus could complete his plan. This early abduction foreshadowed later events, establishing a pattern where Helen's beauty made her worth stealing, worth waging war over, worth dying for. When Helen reached marriageable age, suitors came from every corner of Greece. This wasn't normal courtship. This was a gathering of nearly every important man in Greece, all convinced Helen was worth pursuing, regardless of odds or competition. Ancient sources suggest anywhere from 30 to 45 suitors, including Odysseus, Ajax, Menelaus, Agamemnon, Patroclus, Philoctetes, and Diomedes. Essentially, every significant Greek hero who would later fight at Troy. King Tyndareus faced an impossible situation. How could he choose one suitor without earning the enmity of all the others? Odysseus, cleverest of Greeks, proposed a solution. All suitors should swear a binding oath to accept Helen's chosen husband and defend his rights to her against anyone who threatened the marriage. If anyone tried to take Helen from her husband, all other suitors would be bound to aid him. This transformed potential rivals into a defensive alliance. The suitors agreed, taking what became known as the Oath of Tyndareus, standing over the butchered remains of a sacrificed horse and pledging by all gods to honor Helen's choice. Blood oaths were not taken lightly in the ancient world. Breaking such vows meant earning divine wrath. Tyndareus chose Menelaus as Helen's husband. The choice made political sense. Menelaus was wealthy, powerful through his brother Agamemnon, who ruled Mycenae, and the marriage would bind Sparta to Greece's most dominant kingdom. By most accounts, Helen and Menelaus were initially happy together. They married with appropriate ceremony, Menelaus became king of Sparta when Tyndareus abdicated, and Helen became queen. They had at least one daughter, Hermione, and possibly sons as well, though sources vary. For several years, perhaps as many as 10, Helen lived as Menelaus's faithful wife, raising children, managing the palace, performing queenly duties. But Helen was destined for more than domestic contentment. Christopher Marlowe would later write the immortal line, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium?" That face belonged to a woman who had become, through no fault of her own, a prize rather than a person, an object of desire rather than a subject with her own agency. Paris eventually came to Sparta on what appeared to be a diplomatic mission, though divine manipulation was surely involved. He was received with traditional Greek hospitality, welcomed as a foreign prince into Menelaus's palace, treated as an honored guest. Menelaus had no reason to suspect danger from this handsome young Trojan. But Paris had come for Helen, promised to him by Aphrodite, and Helen, whether through direct divine intervention or through her own response to Paris's youth and beauty, felt drawn to this Trojan prince in ways that violated every oath of marriage and duty of queenship. Ancient sources disagree about Helen's role. Some portray her as a victim seduced by divine power beyond her control. Others depict her as willing participant, choosing love over duty. The truth, based on what we can infer from the conflicting accounts, likely fell somewhere between. A woman caught between divine manipulation and human desire, between what she should do and what she wanted to do. What is certain is that Paris and Helen left Sparta together, sailing away while Menelaus was absent. They took considerable treasure with them. They sailed east across the Aegean toward Troy, where Helen would live for the next 10 years. No longer Helen of Sparta, but Helen of Troy. No longer Menelaus's wife, but Paris's lover, or second wife, depending on interpretation. When Menelaus returned to find both Helen and Paris gone along with significant treasure, his response was immediate. This wasn't merely adultery or a wife leaving her husband. This was theft, violation of guest friendship, sacred bonds in Greek culture, an insult demanding blood vengeance. A host protected his guest, and a guest honored his host. Paris had violated these bonds in the worst way possible, betraying Menelaus's trust, stealing his wife, plundering his wealth. Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon, and together they began calling on all men who had sworn the oath of Tyndareus. The oath was explicit. All Helen's former suitors had pledged to defend her chosen husband's rights against anyone who threatened the marriage. Paris hadn't just threatened the marriage, he had destroyed it. Now the oath demanded that every man who swore it must join Menelaus in recovering Helen by force if necessary. The greatest military expedition the Greek world had ever seen was about to be assembled, not to conquer territory or acquire wealth, but to retrieve a single woman whose beauty had become both blessing and curse. The gathering storm. Assembling the Greek forces took considerable time, perhaps 2 years of preparation, negotiation, and reluctant acceptance of obligations. Many oath-takers had hoped never to fulfill. Agamemnon took charge not because he particularly cared about Menelaus's honor, but because this was an opportunity to assert Mycenae's dominance over all Greece. He sent heralds throughout Greek kingdoms, reminding former suitors of their oath, warning that refusal would mark them as oath breakers. Some came willingly, eager for glory and plunder. Others came reluctantly, bound by oath but resentful. A few tried to avoid the call entirely, but Agamemnon's heralds were persistent, and the shame of oath-breaking too great to bear. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, was one who tried to avoid war. He had recently married Penelope and had a young son, Telemachus. The prospect of leaving his family and peaceful island home held no appeal, oath or not. When Agamemnon's heralds came, Odysseus pretended madness, yoking an ox and donkey together and plowing a field while sowing it with salt, acting as though he'd lost his mind. But Palamedes, one of Agamemnon's cleverest heralds, suspected deception. He placed baby Telemachus directly in front of Odysseus's plow. Odysseus immediately stopped and swerved to avoid his son, proving his sanity. Caught in his deception, Odysseus had no choice but to honor his oath. He would go to Troy, though he wouldn't return home for 20 years. Achilles, who would become the war's greatest warrior, was another reluctant participant. Achilles wasn't one of Helen's suitors. He was too young. But prophecy surrounded him from birth. His mother was Thetis, the sea nymph from whose wedding this entire catastrophe had originated. The prophecy stated, Achilles could choose between two fates: a long, peaceful life of obscurity, or a short, glorious life of heroic fame. If Achilles went to Troy, he would die young, but his name would live forever. If he avoided Troy, he would live to old age but be forgotten. Thetis, knowing what awaited her son at Troy, tried to prevent him from going. She hid Achilles on the island of Skyros, disguising him as a girl among King Lycomedes's daughters. But Odysseus, already conscripted and perhaps bitter about being forced to go, arrived at Skyros, searching for Achilles. He came disguised as a merchant, spreading out goods for the king's daughters to examine: jewelry, fine cloth, cosmetics, and among these, a sword and spear. The young women admired jewelry and cloth, but one figure, taller and more muscular, immediately reached for the weapons. Examining them with warrior expertise, Odysseus had found Achilles. Confronted with his identity, offered the choice between obscurity and glory, Achilles chose glory. He would go to Troy, fight and die young, but his name would echo through eternity. The fleet assembled at Aulis, a harbor on Boeotia's coast. Ship after ship arrived from every major kingdom. Homer's Iliad provides detailed listings of forces. Agamemnon brought 100 ships from Mycenae, Menelaus 60 from Sparta, Nestor 90 from Pylos, Odysseus 12 from Ithaca. Ancient sources suggest the total fleet numbered around 1,000 ships, each carrying perhaps 50 men, meaning a total force of roughly 50,000 warriors. An enormous army for the Bronze Age, possibly the largest military expedition ever assembled in the ancient Mediterranean up to that point. But the fleet could not sail. Winds blew from the north when they needed southern winds to carry ships across the Aegean to Troy. Day after day, the fleet sat at Aulis, consuming supplies, growing restless. Weeks passed, then months. Doubts crept in. Was one woman worth all this effort? Then the prophet Calchas delivered a devastating pronouncement. The goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon and would not allow favorable winds until the king appeased her with sacrifice, specifically his own daughter, Iphigenia. The reasons for Artemis's anger varied in different accounts. Perhaps Agamemnon had boasted that his hunting skills surpassed hers. Perhaps he'd killed one of her sacred deer. Perhaps she simply wanted to test his resolve. Whatever her reasons, her demand was absolute. No Iphigenia, no winds, no war. Agamemnon faced an impossible choice: sacrifice his daughter and earn his wife Clytemnestra's eternal hatred, or abandon the expedition and lose authority over assembled kings. Ambition won. Agamemnon sent word to Clytemnestra that Iphigenia was to marry Achilles, and the queens should send their daughter to Aulis for the wedding. Clytemnestra, pleased, sent Iphigenia to her father. When the girl arrived, she discovered the truth. There would be no wedding, only sacrifice. What happened next varies depending on which version one follows. In the most famous telling preserved by playwrights like Aeschylus and Euripides, Iphigenia was led to the altar and killed, her throat cut, her blood spilled to appease Artemis. Her mother's curse followed Agamemnon from that moment forward. In another version, more merciful to modern sensibilities, Artemis, at the last moment, substituted a deer for Iphigenia, spiriting the girl away to become a priestess while leaving Agamemnon to believe he'd killed her. Either way, the sacrifice was made, or appeared to be made. Artemis was appeased, and the winds changed. The fleet could finally sail. The Greek armada crossed the Aegean. 1,000 ships bearing 50,000 warriors, the largest military force the ancient world had yet seen. They sailed east toward Troy, toward the war that would define an age. The Siege of Troy. Troy was formidable. The city sat on a hill overlooking the Scamander River plain, about 4 miles inland from the Hellespont in what is now northwestern Turkey. Its walls were legendary, said by mythological tradition to have been built by Apollo and Poseidon themselves. Whether divinely constructed or not, Troy's fortifications were genuinely impressive. Archaeological excavations at Hisarlik, identified as likely ancient Troy, have revealed 9 settlement layers spanning thousands of years. Troy 6 and Troy 7a, corresponding roughly to 1700 to 1180 BCE, match the period when the Trojan War might have occurred. These layers show massive stone walls, several meters thick, that had withstood attacks for generations. The city was wealthy, grown rich from controlling the Hellespont entrance and demanding tolls from ships passing through to trade with Black Sea kingdoms. Troy's palace complex housed King Priam and his extended family, including 50 sons by various wives and concubines, and numerous daughters. Most notable of Priam's sons were Hector, the eldest legitimate son and Troy's greatest warrior, and Paris, whose actions had brought the Greek army to Troy's shores. Hector's wife was Andromache, and their young son Astyanax represented Troy's royal line's future. The Greek army landed on beaches near Troy and immediately established a fortified camp. pulling ships onto shore and building defensive walls from timber and earth. This camp would be their home for 10 years. A city of tents housing 50,000 men far from their families. Supply lines were crucial. The army couldn't sustain itself from the immediate area alone. So ships constantly traveled between Greece and Troy, bringing food, wine, weapons, and replacements for men lost to battle and disease. The war consisted largely of siege, punctuated by battles on the plain between Greek camp and Troy's walls. The Greeks couldn't simply storm the city. Troy's walls were too strong, its defenders too numerous and determined. Instead, they settled for a long siege, hoping to starve the city or wear down defenders until an opportunity arose to breach walls. Meanwhile, they raided surrounding countryside, attacking Troy's allies, conquering nearby cities, carrying off plunder and captives. Homer's Iliad, our most detailed source, focuses on just a few weeks during the 10th year, specifically a period when Achilles had withdrawn from battle in anger at Agamemnon. The poem doesn't tell the entire war story. It assumes audiences already know how the war began and will end. Instead, it focuses on a specific crisis, exploring themes of honor, rage, mortality, and relationships between men and gods. Fighting, when it occurred, was brutal and personal by Bronze Age warfare standards. Combat consisted largely of individual duels between champions, heroes fighting one-on-one while armies watched. Homer describes these combats graphically: spears piercing throats, swords crushing skulls, entrails spilling onto dusty plains, warriors dying with final words on their lips. Gods took sides, making it not just human war, but divine contest. Hera and Athena, still angry at Paris for not choosing them, supported Greeks fanatically Aphrodite. Having promised Helen to Paris, naturally supported Troy, along with Apollo and Ares. Gods didn't simply watch from Olympus. They walked among armies, sometimes disguised, sometimes openly, fighting beside chosen champions. On the Greek side, Achilles stood supreme, the greatest warrior of his generation, faster and stronger than any other man, trained by the centaur Chiron, armored by divine craftsmanship. Ajax, massive and powerful, fought with methodical strength. Diomedes, young but brilliant, fought with such fury that he wounded gods themselves. Odysseus fought primarily with cunning rather than strength. On Troy's side, Hector was the bulwark of defense. As Priam's eldest son and Troy's greatest warrior, Hector bore responsibility for his city's survival. Homer portrays him as the Iliad's most sympathetic character, devoted to family, tender with wife and infant son, brave but not bloodthirsty, fighting to protect his home. He knew Troy's cause was unjust, knew Paris had wronged Menelaus, yet he fought anyway because Troy was his city, his father was king, his wife and son lived within those walls. 9 years passed in brutal stalemate. Greeks couldn't breach Troy's walls. Trojans couldn't drive Greeks into the sea. Men died by hundreds, then thousands. Both sides began questioning whether the war was worth continuing. Greeks had left kingdoms unguarded for nearly a decade. Trojans saw their city slowly weakening, their allies falling away, their resources depleting, all to protect Paris's claim to a stolen woman. Yet the war continued, driven by forces larger than individual will. Greeks had invested too much to leave empty-handed. Trojans had resisted too long to surrender now, and gods pushed events forward according to their own agendas, turning what might have been resolved through negotiation into an endless cycle of violence and retaliation. The human cost mounted year after year. The Trojan War had become self-sustaining, perpetuating itself through momentum and accumulated grievances, a machine of destruction no one could stop until it had run its course. The Wrath of Achilles. In the 10th year, plague struck the Greek camp. For 9 days, funeral pyres burned continuously. On the 10th day, Achilles called an assembly to determine the cause. Calchas the prophet revealed that Apollo had sent the plague to punish Agamemnon for enslaving Chryseis, daughter of one of Apollo's priests. When her father Chryseis had come offering ransom for her return, Agamemnon had refused insultingly and threatened the old priest. Apollo retaliated by spreading disease. The only remedy was returning Chryseis without ransom and making proper sacrifices. Agamemnon, furious at being forced to give up his prize, but unable to ignore mounting deaths, agreed to return Chryseis. But he refused to accept the status loss. In the Greek camp's hierarchy, honor and status were measured partly by quality and quantity of war prizes. If Agamemnon surrendered Chryseis while others kept their captives, he would appear weak. He demanded compensation, insisting another prize be given from captives held by other leaders. Achilles argued that Agamemnon should wait until Troy fell to claim new prizes. There was no common store of unclaimed plunder. Every captive had been distributed. Taking anyone's prize now would be theft. But Agamemnon, his authority challenged, declared he would take a prize by force if necessary. He singled out Achilles, threatening to claim Briseis, Achilles' own captive woman. The confrontation escalated shockingly fast. Achilles rose, his hand moving to his sword, ready to kill Agamemnon where he stood. Only Athena's intervention stopped him. The goddess, visible to Achilles alone, grabbed him by his hair, warning that killing Agamemnon would destroy the Greek cause. Achilles released his sword, but unleashed verbal fury, calling Agamemnon a greedy coward who never fought in front lines but claimed best prizes. Achilles swore he would fight no more for Agamemnon and the Greeks. Let them face Trojans without his Myrmidons, and see how quickly they were driven back when Achilles' spear no longer protected them. Agamemnon sent heralds to claim Briseis. Achilles didn't resist, but his rage deepened into something darker. He gave up Briseis and withdrew completely from war, taking his Myrmidons with him. Achilles went to the shore and prayed to his mother, Thetis, begging her to use her influence with Zeus to turn the war against Greeks. Let them suffer without him. Let them learn the cost of dishonoring the man who had killed more Trojans than any other warrior. Thetis went to Zeus, reminding him of favors owed, asking him to grant Achilles' request. Zeus, reluctant because helping Troy would anger Hera, eventually agreed. The tide would turn against Greeks. Hector and Trojans would drive them back, threaten their camp, nearly burn their ships. Only when Greeks had suffered enough would the balance shift. And so it happened, exactly as Achilles wished and would come to regret. Without Achilles and his Myrmidons, the Greek army weakened significantly. Hector led Trojan forces in attack after attack. pushing Greeks back toward their ships. Day after day, fighting went against Greece. The defensive wall around Greek camp was breached. Trojan forces poured through, fighting among ships themselves, threatening to burn the fleet and strand Greeks forever. Greek commanders begged Achilles to return. They sent an embassy led by Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, carrying magnificent gifts from Agamemnon. Gold, bronze, horses, captive women. A promise to return Briseis untouched and give Achilles as one of Agamemnon's daughters in marriage. Achilles refused everything. The gifts meant nothing. Agamemnon had dishonored him publicly. No gold could restore honor once lost. Achilles declared he would sail home to Greece the next morning. But Achilles didn't sail home, and he didn't remain completely uninvolved. His closest companion, Patroclus, couldn't bear watching Greeks being slaughtered while they sat idle. Patroclus was Achilles' cousin and closest friend, perhaps his lover. Ancient sources disagree on their relationship's exact nature. What's certain is that their bond ran deeper than ordinary friendship, that they loved each other with intensity that made them nearly inseparable. Patroclus came to Achilles, weeping for Greeks dying while they did nothing. He begged Achilles to reconsider. When Achilles still refused, hardened by pride and wounded honor, Patroclus made a desperate proposal. Let him wear Achilles' distinctive armor and lead Myrmidons into battle Trojans, seeing what they believed was Achilles returning, would flee in terror. The threat alone might turn the tide. Achilles hesitated but eventually agreed, giving Patroclus his armor, spear, helmet, with distinctive horsehair plume. But he warned Patroclus strictly, drive Trojans back from ships, then return immediately. Don't pursue them across the plain. Don't approach Troy's walls. The intervention should be limited, just enough to save the Greek fleet. Patroclus led Myrmidons in a sudden charge that caught Trojans by surprise. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Trojans, seeing the distinctive armor, believing Achilles had returned, turned and ran. Myrmidons drove through Trojan lines, pushing them back from ships, saving the fleet. But Patroclus, caught up in battle fury, intoxicated by success, forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued fleeing Trojans across the plain, killing warrior after warrior, driving them towards city walls. He killed Sarpedon, a son of Zeus and one of Troy's most important allies. Still, he pressed forward until he reached Troy's walls themselves. Apollo intervened, protecting Troy as he had throughout the war. The gods struck Patroclus with divine force, stunning him, knocking Achilles' helmet from his head, breaking the spear in his hands, stripping armor from his body. Patroclus stood exposed, confused, barely able to defend himself. A minor Trojan warrior, Euphorbus, drove a spear into Patroclus's back. Then Hector, who throughout battle had been driven back by what he believed was Achilles, saw this wasn't Achilles at all, but an imposter. Hector charged and drove his spear through Patroclus's stomach, killing him. Patroclus fell, gasping Achilles' name, gasping a dying prophecy that Hector too would soon fall, killed by Achilles in revenge. Hector stripped Achilles' armor from Patroclus's corpse. A fierce battle erupted over the body. Finally, Menelaus and Ajax recovered it and carried it back to Greek camp. When Achilles learned of Patroclus's death, his grief was so terrible his mother heard his wailing from beneath the sea. She came to him and found him destroyed, The anger that had kept him from battle vanished, replaced by something worse, focused, burning need for vengeance. Achilles declared he would kill Hector, even knowing his own death would soon follow. Thetis revealed the specifics. Achilles' death was fated to come soon after Hector's. If Achilles killed Hector, he would die. But Achilles no longer cared about prophecies or living to old age. In obscurity, Patroclus was dead. Nothing mattered except revenge. Thetis went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, begging him to forge new armor for Achilles. Hephaestus, who owed Thetis a debt, agreed. Working through the night, he created armor of surpassing beauty, a shield decorated with scenes depicting all human life, a breastplate no weapon could pierce, a helmet that gleamed like fire. The armor wasn't just protective equipment, it was masterpiece reflecting its wearer's glory and tragic fate. At dawn, Achilles put on his new armor and formally renounced his anger at Agamemnon. He would fight again, not for Agamemnon or Greece, but for Patroclus, to avenge his beloved friend's death. Then Achilles armed himself completely and led Myrmidons toward Troy. Trojans saw him coming across the plain, gleaming in divine armor, and terror spread through their ranks. This wasn't the Achilles who had sat beside ships sulking. This was something else entirely. Achilles transformed into instrument of death. Achilles with nothing to lose. Achilles who had chosen glory and death over life and obscurity. The fall of Hector and the death of Achilles. Achilles' return to battle was like a force of nature unleashed. He cut through Trojan ranks as a scythe cuts wheat, killing dozens, driving hundreds before him in panic. Turning the Scamander River red with blood, Trojans fled in terror back toward their city, pouring through gates seeking safety behind legendary walls. Only Hector remained outside, standing alone before the Scaean gates, waiting to face Achilles, despite his parents' pleas from the walls to come inside. But Hector couldn't flee. He was Troy's defender, and he had killed Patroclus while wearing Achilles' armor that he now bore on his own back. If he ran now, hid behind walls while the greatest warrior came for him, he would be disgraced forever. Better to die with honor than live as coward. Yet when Achilles came close enough that Hector could see his face, see the terrible emptiness in his eyes, the absolute certainty of death, Hector's courage failed. He ran. The greatest warrior of Troy ran in terror before Achilles. He didn't run toward gates and safety. They were too far. Instead, he ran around Troy's walls, with Achilles pursuing, the two heroes racing around the entire circuit 3 times while both armies watched. Athena, still hating Troy for Paris's judgment against her, intervened through deception. She appeared to Hector in the form of his brother Deiphobus, claiming to have come from the city to help fight Achilles encouraged. Believing he wouldn't face Achilles alone, Hector finally stopped and turned. He tried to propose terms, asking Achilles to promise that whoever died, the victor would return the loser's body for proper funeral rites. Achilles refused with cold fury. There would be no terms, no honor, no mercy. Lions don't make pacts with men. They fought, and it was no contest. Hector was brave and skilled, but Achilles was something beyond human. The greatest warrior of his generation wielding God-forged weapons and driven by grief that made him unstoppable. Hector called for Deiphobus to hand him a spear, but when he turned, his brother was gone. It had been Athena in disguise, and now she had abandoned Hector to his fate. He was alone. Recognizing he'd been tricked and death was inevitable, Hector resolved to die fighting rather than fleeing. He drew his sword and charged. Achilles' spear caught Hector in the throat, the one spot not protected by the armor Hector wore. Achilles' own armor stripped from Patroclus' body. Hector fell, his blood soaking Troy's dust, his eyes dimming as he gasped final words. He begged Achilles again to return his body to his father for proper burial, offering any ransom Priam might pay. But Achilles, face twisted with hatred, refused again. He swore no one would burn Hector's corpse with honor, that dogs and birds would feast on his flesh. Then Achilles committed an act that shocked even his allies, violating every warfare custom, every principle of honor. He pierced Hector's ankles, threaded leather straps through the wounds, and tied the straps to his chariot. Then he mounted and drove back toward Greek camp, dragging Hector's body behind him through dust, around Troy's walls, while Priam, Hecuba, and Andromache watched in horror from above. For days, Achilles desecrated Hector's corpse. Each morning he dragged it around Patroclus' funeral mound. But the gods, even those favoring Greeks, found this offensive. Apollo and Aphrodite protected Hector's body from decay and disfigurement. Zeus finally sent a message through Thetis. The gods were angry at his treatment of Hector's corpse. He must return it to Priam for proper burial. That night, Priam came to Achilles' tent. The old king, guided by Hermes, entered Greek camp alone, passing through enemy lines to kneel before the man who had killed his son Priam, carried rich ransom, but more importantly came as father begging for his son's body. He kissed Achilles' hands, the hands that had killed Hector, and wept, speaking of his own father Peleus, waiting far away in Greece for a son who would never return home. Achilles, confronted with Priam's grief and his own mortality, finally found some measure of humanity again. He wept with Priam, the two enemies united in shared grief and terrible knowledge of what war cost those who fought it. He accepted the ransom and agreed to return Hector's body. More than that, he promised a truce of 12 days so Troy could properly mourn its greatest defender. Homer's Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, but the war continued. Achilles returned to battle, killing more Trojans, including Amazon queen Penthesilea, who had come to aid Troy, and whom some sources suggest Achilles fell in love with the moment after killing her, seeing her face for the first time as she died. He killed Memnon, an Ethiopian king and son of goddess Eos. Achilles seemed invincible, unstoppable. His death, when it came, was both heroic and pathetic. Paris, the least warlike of Priam's sons, the prince whose actions had started the entire war, fired an arrow at Achilles. It wasn't particularly well aimed. Paris was no great archer, but Apollo guided the arrow, directing it to the one vulnerable spot on Achilles' body, his heel. According to later traditions, Thetis had dipped infant Achilles in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, but she held him by the heel, leaving that spot unprotected. The arrow struck true, bringing down the greatest warrior with a shot that would have been a minor wound anywhere else. Achilles fell, still fighting, trying to reach Paris to kill him before death claimed him. But the poison and severity of wound overcame even Achilles' immense vitality. He died on Troy's plains, far from his home in Thessaly, far from his father Peleus, just as prophecy had always foretold. His death fulfilled the choice he'd made years before: short life of glory rather than long life of obscurity. His name would indeed live forever, but Achilles himself was gone. A fierce battle erupted over Achilles' body. Ajax and Odysseus fought off Trojans and carried Achilles' body back to Greek camp, where it was burned with all honor on a massive funeral pyre. His ashes were mixed with Patroclus's and placed in a golden urn given by Thetis. The two friends, inseparable in life, remained together in death. Funeral games were held in Achilles' honor. Odysseus won the armor through eloquence rather than martial prowess, which so angered Ajax that the great warrior went mad and later killed himself in shame. Greeks had lost their greatest warrior. Troy had lost Hector. Both sides were exhausted by 10 years of siege, depleted in resources and morale, yet neither could find path to honorable peace. The war had consumed too much, cost too many lives, demanded too much sacrifice to end in anything but total victory or total defeat. The siege continued, dragging toward its conclusion, waiting for the clever mind that would finally break the stalemate and bring the war to its devastating end. The wooden horse. With Achilles dead and Hector dead, the war entered its final phase. A war of exhaustion where neither side had strength to achieve decisive victory through conventional means. Prophecies, however, had foretold what conditions must be met for Troy to fall. Based on what ancient sources preserve, the Greeks would need the bow and arrows of Heracles, carried by Philoctetes, who had been abandoned on an island years earlier. They would need Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, to take his father's place. And they would need the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena kept in Troy's temple, which protected the city as long as it remained there. Odysseus, craftiest of Greeks, managed to fulfill these prophecies. He brought Philoctetes back from exile. He fetched Neoptolemus from Skyros, and he snuck into Troy with Diomedes, entering through secret passages, killing temple guards, and stealing the Palladium. All prophesied conditions had been met, but the city still stood, walls still impregnable, gates still closed. Then Odysseus proposed a plan more audacious than anything attempted in 10 years of siege. The Greeks would build a massive wooden horse, large enough to hide warriors inside, and leave it on the beach as a parent offering to Athena. Then the Greek fleet would sail away, making it appear they'd finally abandoned the siege and were returning home. The Trojans, believing the war over, would take the horse into their city as trophy. That night, warriors hidden inside would emerge, open city gates, and let in the Greek army, which would return under darkness to sack the city. It was a plan built on deception, on exploiting Trojans' desire to believe the war was finally over. Many Greeks opposed it, considering trickery dishonorable compared to open warfare. But after 10 years with no victory in sight, after losing Achilles and so many heroes, after exhausting kingdom's resources, Greeks were willing to try anything. Epeius, skilled carpenter and fighter, was put in charge of construction. With Ajax the Lesser's help and other craftsmen, he spent weeks building a wooden structure unlike anything attempted before. It had to be enormous, large enough to hold 30 or 40 warriors, depending on which ancient source one consults. Yet not so large it would be obviously hollow. It had to be beautiful enough to convince Trojans it was genuinely votive offering rather than military weapon. And it had to be strong enough to survive being pulled through Troy's gates without breaking apart. According to various ancient accounts, the horse was built from timbers cut on Mount Ida, shaped and fitted with incredible precision. It stood as tall as a 3-story building, with mane carved from wood and painted to look like real horsehair, with eyes made from precious stones that seemed to gleam with life. Greeks carved an inscription on its flank. For their safe return home, the Greeks dedicate this offering to Athena. Inside the horse's belly, accessible through a trapdoor hidden in its side, was a hollow compartment. Greeks selected their best warriors for this mission. Odysseus himself, who had devised the plan, Menelaus, whose wife had been the war's cause, Diomedes, one of the greatest fighters, Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, and others, perhaps 30 warriors total, picked for courage, fighting skill, and ability to remain silent and motionless for hours or days if necessary. The night before the plan unfolded, these warriors climbed into the horse and settled into cramped darkness. The trapdoor was sealed. The Greek army broke camp, burned tents, loaded ships, and sailed away. They didn't go far, just to Tenedos Island a few miles offshore, where they could wait out of Troy's walls' sight. One Greek remained behind, Sinon, a distant relative of Odysseus, who volunteered to stay and spin the lie that would convince Trojans to take the horse inside their city. At dawn, Trojan scouts emerged cautiously from gates. The Greek camp was deserted. Ships were gone. On the beach stood only the enormous wooden horse, glinting in early morning sun. Trojans could hardly believe their eyes. After 10 years, after losing so many warriors, including great Hector, after enduring deprivation and death, could it really be over? Had Greeks really given up and gone home? Priam and his remaining sons came down to the beach, followed by growing crowds who had been trapped inside walls for a decade. They surrounded the horse, marveling at its size, debating what to do. Some, like Themoides, proposed dragging it into the city as trophy. Others, like Capys, suggested destroying it. Then Laocoon arrived, a priest of Poseidon, running down from the city with a crowd following. His words, preserved by Virgil in the Aeneid, would become immortal. Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes. I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts. Laocoon saw through the deception immediately. Why would Greeks leave such valuable offering? Why make it so large it couldn't fit through Troy's gates without destroying part of the wall? This was a trick, Laocoon insisted. Either Greeks were hiding inside, or the horse was siege engine, or it was cursed. Don't trust this gift. Burn it, break it, throw it into the sea, but don't bring it inside. To prove his point, Laocoon hurled his spear at the horse's flank. The spear struck and stuck there, quivering. The horse rang with hollow sound that clearly indicated it was empty inside. For a moment, Laocoon's warning might be heeded. But then Trojan soldiers brought forward a prisoner. Sinon, hands bound, filthy and terrified, or appearing terrified as part of his role. Sinon told a perfectly crafted lie, mixing enough truth with falsehood to make the whole believable. He claimed to be a Greek who had fled because the army planned to sacrifice him to ensure fair winds for their voyage home, just as Iphigenia had been sacrificed 10 years earlier at Aulis. He said he'd escaped and hidden while Greeks searched. Then the fleet sailed without him. Trojans, sympathetic to someone mistreated by their enemies, released his bonds and listened. Sinon explained Greeks had built the horse as offering to Athena to atone for stealing the palladium from her temple. The goddess was angry at Greeks, Sinon claimed, and they needed to appease her before sailing home. They made the horse huge, specifically to prevent Trojans from taking it inside their city, because Calchas, the prophet, had declared that if Troy took possession of the horse, Athena's favor would shift to Trojans, who could then invade Greece successfully. It was masterful deception because it played perfectly on Trojan psychology. It explained Greeks' departure, explained the horse's size, and most cleverly, made Trojans want to take the horse inside precisely because Greeks supposedly didn't want them to. If bringing the horse into Troy would earn Athena's favor and allow Troy to eventually conquer Greece, then of course they should bring it in. But Laocoon wasn't convinced. He continued arguing, growing desperate as he saw Trojans beginning to believe Sinon's lies. Then something happened that sealed Troy's doom. 2 enormous serpents emerged from the sea and slithered toward the city with terrifying speed. Trojans scattered as serpents headed straight for Laocoon. Before horrified eyes of the entire city, serpents wrapped around Laocoon and his 2 young sons, who had been assisting him at sacrifice to Poseidon, crushing them, strangling them, killing all 3 while their screams echoed off Troy's walls. The serpents then slithered to Athena's temple and disappeared inside. Trojans interpreted this as clear sign from the gods. Laocoon had been punished for throwing his spear at the horse, for attempting to defile sacred offering to Athena. Sinon had spoken truth. The horse was holy. It should be brought into the city immediately. The evidence suggests, based on what we know of how divine intervention operates in Greek mythology, that the serpents had been sent by Athena herself, or possibly Poseidon, both gods who favored Greeks and wanted Troy to fall. But Trojans didn't question why gods would so viciously punish someone for offering sensible military advice. And so, against all reason, against warnings that would have saved them, Trojans decided to bring the wooden horse into their city. The problem was, it was too large to fit through any existing gates. They had to partially dismantle the wall beside the Scaean gate. Hundreds labored with ropes and wooden rollers, slowly pulling the enormous horse through the breach in their walls. The very walls that had protected them for 10 years, now broken open by their own hands to admit their doom. All day they worked, finally getting the horse inside and positioned in the main square near Athena's temple. That night, Troy celebrated. The siege was over. Greeks were gone. They had survived. Wine flowed freely. People danced in streets. Troy celebrated its deliverance from war, not knowing war was already inside the walls, hidden in the wooden horse's belly, waiting for silence and darkness. Finally, celebrations wound down. Wine-soaked Trojans stumbled home to beds. Fires burned low. The city fell silent, exhausted, sleeping more soundly than it had in 10 years. And on Tenedos Island, the Greek fleet saw the signal fire that Sinon lit, telling them Trojans had taken the bait, that the time had come. The fall of Troy. Inside the wooden horse, Greek warriors had endured hours of cramped silence in total darkness. Now, in dead of night, Odysseus judged the time had come. He carefully opened the trap door. Epeius lowered a rope. One by one, warriors descended, dropping silently to the ground, weapons ready. But the square was empty. Fires had burned down to embers. Guards who should have been watching were either asleep or drunk on celebration wine. Greek warriors moved through darkness like ghosts, heading for main gates. They killed few guards they encountered, trying to keep death silent. When they reached gates, they lifted massive bars that had held against 10 years of Greek siege and swung gates open wide. On the beach below, the Greek fleet was already returning, rowing hard from Tenedos. When they saw gates open and signal fires lit, they redoubled speed. The army that Troy thought gone forever stormed through open gates, thousands flooding into the city, spreading through streets, setting fires, killing anyone encountered. Trojans woke to find their city invaded, walls breached from within, enemy already among them with swords drawn and houses burning. Chaos erupted. Warriors stumbled from beds searching for armor, for weapons, trying to organize resistance while half-drunk and disoriented. Priam, the old king, managed to don armor and take up spear, intending to die fighting, but he was too old, too slow. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, found Priam at an altar where the king had taken refuge and killed him there, butchering an old man who could barely lift his weapon, desecrating sacred ground with royal blood. Hector's widow Andromache was captured and enslaved, given to Neoptolemus as prize. Her son Astyanax, heir to Troy's throne, was taken from her arms and thrown from city walls to his death. Greeks couldn't allow any of Priam's male descendants to survive. They might grow up seeking vengeance and rebuild Troy. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Cassandra was dragged from Athena's temple and given to Agamemnon as his concubine. The sack of Troy lasted through the night and into the next day. Houses were ransacked, treasures stolen, women enslaved, children killed. Great palaces were stripped of gold and silver, bronze weapons, precious objects accumulated through generations. The city that had stood for centuries was being systematically destroyed by men who had spent 10 years trying to breach its walls from outside. Helen, the woman whose abduction had started the war, was found in the palace. Menelaus stormed through searching for her, his sword drawn, apparently intending to kill her for adultery that had cost 10 years and thousands of lives. But when he found her, when he saw her face again after 10 years, her beauty stopped him. Different sources tell the story differently. In some versions, Helen prostrated herself, begging mercy, and he couldn't bring himself to kill her. In others, she simply stood before him, and her beauty was enough to make him lower his sword. Either way, Menelaus didn't kill Helen. He would take her back to Sparta as his wife. By the time sun set on the second day, Troy was finished. Palaces had been looted and burned. Temples ransacked despite sacrilege. Most male population killed. Most women and children enslaved. City walls were partially demolished to ensure Troy could never rise again as military power. Surviving Greek warriors divided plunder and captives among themselves. Agamemnon claimed greatest prizes, including Cassandra. Neoptolemus took Andromache. The Greek fleet prepared to sail home, loaded with treasure, with enslaved Trojans, with spoils that would justify 10 years of siege. But the return voyage would prove almost as difficult and deadly as the war itself. The archaeological evidence from the site of Troy at Hisarlik tells us something remarkable. Around 1180 BCE, at approximately the traditional date of the Trojan War, the city identified as Troy. 7a was indeed violently destroyed. The ruins show evidence of fire and slaughter, of a city sacked and abandoned. Whether this destruction resulted from the war Homer described, or from some other conflict, remains one of archaeology's great mysteries. Aftermath and legacy, the truth behind the myth. The immediate aftermath brought not triumph but tragedy for many participants. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, whose vengeance for Iphigenia's sacrifice had been patient but absolute Menelaus, and Helen eventually returned to Sparta after wandering 7 years through the Mediterranean. Odysseus's return took 10 years. Facing adventures that became their own epic, Neoptolemus brought Andromache back to Greece as his slave. And she spent the rest of her life far from Troy, a living reminder of what war had taken from the vanquished. But here's what makes the Trojan War truly fascinating. And this is something that deserves careful consideration based on more than a century of archaeological investigation. There may actually be truth buried within the myth. For centuries, scholars dismissed the Trojan War as pure fantasy. Then in 1870, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, convinced that Homer's poems described real places, began excavating at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. What he found shocked the scholarly world. Hisarlik revealed 9 layers of settlement spanning from 3000 BCE to 500 CE. Troy 6th and Troy 3rd, dating to the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1700 to 1180 BCE, matched the period when the Trojan War supposedly occurred. Troy 7a was violently destroyed around 1180 BCE, at approximately the traditional war date. The city was larger than initially thought, with a lower town housing perhaps 7,000 people at its height. Troy controlled important trade routes. And here's where it gets remarkable. Troy appears in Hittite documents from the period as Wilusa, which many scholars believe corresponds to Ilios, Homer's name for Troy. These Hittite texts mention conflicts involving Wilusa and possibly Ahiawa, which numerous scholars identify with the Mycenaean Greeks Homer, called Achaeans. So what can we reasonably conclude? The evidence suggests that something real inspired Homer's epic. There was a wealthy city at the location tradition identified as Troy. That city was destroyed violently in the late Bronze Age. Mycenaean Greeks had military capacity to mount such an expedition, as shown by their massive palace complexes and warrior burials. Hittite documents hint at political and military tensions between Mycenaean Greece and northwestern Anatolia during the relevant period. But nothing proves the specific war Homer described actually occurred as he told it, that Helen existed, that Achilles and Hector fought, that a wooden horse brought about the city's fall. What we can say is that the myth likely preserved memories of real Bronze Age conflicts, transformed over centuries of oral transmission into the epic that Homer finally wrote down around 750 BCE, some 400 years after the events would have occurred. And this leads to perhaps the most intriguing possibility. The wooden horse itself might be based on reality, though not in the way the myth describes. Several scholars have proposed that the horse was actually a siege engine, perhaps a battering ram covered in horse hides, which was common in ancient warfare. Others suggest it could be a metaphor for an earthquake. Poseidon was god of both horses and earthquakes that damaged Troy's walls. Still others propose it might represent Trojan exiles or traders who opened the gates from inside. We can't know for certain, but the idea that some kernel of truth lies beneath the fantastic tale is supported by how oral traditions typically work. They preserve real events, but transform details over centuries of retelling. What Homer created was something more lasting than historical record. He transformed whatever Bronze Age conflicts occurred into a story that speaks to fundamental human experiences. The tension between honor and survival, the glory and horror of warfare, the bonds between friends, the tragedy of gifted individuals caught in historical forces beyond their control. The Iliad doesn't glorify war. It shows war as simultaneously heroic and horrific, necessary and devastating. The Trojan War became foundational to Western literature. Romans claimed descent from Trojan refugees, making the fall of Troy central to their origin story. In Virgil's Aeneid, medieval Europeans retold Trojan stories, with various dynasties claiming Trojan ancestry. Renaissance writers reimagined the myths. Modern authors from James Joyce to Margaret Atwood to Pat Barker have retold the story, often shifting perspective to marginalized characters. But perhaps most importantly, the Trojan War endures because it tells truths that transcend its Bronze Age setting. Wars are started by leaders and fought by ordinary people who pay the price for others' decisions. Beauty and desire can destroy kingdoms. Pride and honor, pushed too far, become fatal flaws. Rage, however justified, consumes everything, including those who embrace it. The gods, if they exist, are not necessarily just. They have their own agendas that rarely align with human welfare. The golden apple that started everything represents how small seeds of conflict can grow into catastrophes. A snub at a party led to divine vanity, which led to judgment about beauty, which led to promise about love, which led to abduction, which led to oath-keeping, which led to assembly of armies, which led to 10 years of siege, which led to destruction of one of the Bronze Age's greatest cities. The chain of causation stretches from divine spite to human ruin, each link seemingly minor until viewed from a distance. And that wooden horse has become the ultimate symbol of deception disguised as gift, of danger hidden within apparent safety. We still use the term Trojan horse to describe threats hidden within seemingly beneficial offerings. The image of Trojans pulling their own doom through their gates, destroying their walls to admit the horse, ignoring warnings of those who saw through deception, serves as eternal reminder that we often engineer our own destruction, that hubris and wishful thinking blind us to obvious dangers. Conclusion: what the Bronze Age teaches us. Let your breathing slow further now as this long tale draws toward its close. The plains of Troy are quiet now, the heroes long dead, their bronze armor corroded to dust, their names surviving only in stories told across 3,000 years. But something about this war refuses to remain in the past. Here's the final truth that brings everything together. The revelation that recontextualizes everything we've explored. The Trojan War wasn't really about Helen at all. She was the excuse, not the cause. Archaeological evidence and Hittite documents suggest that what we call the Trojan War might actually reflect decades or even centuries of conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian powers over control of the trade routes through the Hellespont Bronze Age kingdoms, fought over resources, trade, power, the same things nations fight over today. Helen's abduction, if it happened at all, would have been the diplomatic incident that finally justified a war both sides had been building toward for economic and strategic reasons. The myth transformed these prosaic economic conflicts into a story about beauty, honor, and divine intervention, because that's what makes a tale worth remembering for 3 millennia. But underneath the poetry, underneath the gods and heroes, might lie a far more familiar story. Kingdoms competing for resources and trade dominance, using whatever justification they could to mobilize their populations for a war that would benefit the powerful while ordinary soldiers paid the price. This doesn't diminish the myth's power, it enhances it. Because what Homer understood, what has made his work endure for nearly 3,000 years, is that the reasons for war matter less than war's human cost. Whether Greeks really fought over Helen's beauty, or over control of trade routes to the Black Sea, warriors still died far from home. Wives still became widows, children still lost fathers, and cities still burned. The Trojan War story endures, not because of its historical accuracy, but because it captures universal truths about human nature, about how conflicts escalate, about how those who start wars rarely pay their price, about how beauty and desire and honor and rage can all be weaponized by those seeking power. We tell the story because it reminds us that human nature hasn't changed in 3 millennia. We still fight wars over resources while telling ourselves we're defending principles. We still make small choices that cascade into catastrophes. We still ignore warnings that prove accurate because they're inconvenient. We still sacrifice others for our ambitions while telling ourselves we're acting nobly. But the story also shows glimpses of nobility within horror. Hector knowing he'll die, but facing Achilles anyway to defend his city. Achilles finally returning Hector's body because he recognizes shared grief with Priam Odysseus, using intelligence rather than brute force. These moments shine because they represent our better nature, our capacity for courage, loyalty, mercy, even when everything argues for rage and revenge. The gods of Olympus have faded, no longer worshipped except in scholarly study. But the humans in the story remain recognizable. We know people like Agamemnon, powerful but brittle, willing to sacrifice anything to maintain position. We know people like Paris, charming and weak, following desire without considering consequences. We know people like Helen, acted upon rather than acting, blamed for choices that weren't entirely theirs. We know people like Achilles, supremely talented but destroyed by wounded pride. And we know that moment when the Trojans stood before the wooden horse, when Laocoon warned them and they didn't listen, when they chose to believe what they wanted to believe, rather than face uncomfortable truth. We know that moment because we live it repeatedly. When we ignore climate scientists, when we dismiss warnings about pandemics, when we pull our own doom through our gates because we desperately want to believe the war is over, the danger has passed, that we can finally rest. The Trojan War story survives because it's not really about Troy. It's about us. About every civilization that has ever convinced itself that this time will be different, that our walls will hold, that our enemies will give up and go home, that our leaders are telling the truth about why we must fight. It's about how quickly glory turns to grief, how thin the line between victor and victim, how easily the defended become the destroyed. Rest now knowing that stories change, that victims can become symbols of strength, that the silenced can speak again through those who refuse to let them be forgotten. Sleep well, knowing that the Trojan War's real lesson isn't about divine prophecies or heroic combat, or even about clever strategies that win wars. It's about how easily we repeat the same mistakes, generation after generation, century after century, pulling new wooden horses through new gates, ignoring new Laocoons, shouting warnings we don't want to hear. The tale is ended. The heroes have fallen. Troy has burned and been rebuilt and burned again across 3,000 years of human history. But the questions remain. When will we learn? When will we listen to warnings? When will we stop pulling doom through our gates and calling it victory? Perhaps that's why we keep telling the story. Not because we've learned its lessons, but because we hope that someday, finally, we will. Good night. And may we all wake wiser than we slept. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Trojan War. If you enjoyed this exploration of how a golden apple destroyed a civilization, please subscribe to Sleepable Mythology for more deep dives into ancient myths. Let us know in the comments which myth you'd like us to explore next. Rest well, and may your dreams be filled with heroes and distant Bronze Age shores. Good night.